It is the afternoon of October 14th, 1066. The air over a hill in southern England tastes like copper and smoke. Thousands of men are screaming, not words anymore, just noise, the noise a human throat makes when it has been shouting for 4 hours straight. Horses are down, shields are split like kindling. The grass on Senlac Hill, which this morning was green, is now the color of rust. And then a sound spreads through the Norman army that is worse than any sword blow. The Duke is dead. It moves through the ranks the way fire moves through dry hay. Man to man, shout to shout, he's dead. William is dead. And here is the terrible truth about medieval battles that no sword or shield can protect you from. An army does not run because it is losing. An army runs because it stops believing it can win. And in this exact moment, on this exact hillside, thousands of armored men who have followed one leader across a sea into a strange land against an enemy dug in on the high ground, thousands of them are starting, one by one, to believe the fight is already lost. Some begin to turn their horses. Some begin to step backward, shields still raised, eyes already searching for the way out. This is it. This is the moment the entire invasion, months of planning, years of ambition, a lifetime of clawing his way up from nothing, could simply dissolve into a stampede of panicking men. And then, out of the smoke and the noise and the chaos, a rider comes crashing through his own retreating soldiers. He rips off his helmet. Right there, in the open, with enemy arrows still falling out of the sky like black rain. He turns his horse hard, once, twice, so every man on that hillside can see his face, his actual, living, furious face, and he roars at them to look at him, to see that he is not dead, that he is right here, that the man they are fighting for has not fallen, and is not falling, and will not fall today. Who does that? Who rides bareheaded into a wall of enemy arrows just to prove he's still breathing? This is William. Some people, even now, still call him the bastard, and we're going to talk honestly about exactly what that word meant and why it followed him his entire life. By the end of this day, other people will start calling him something else entirely. But to understand how a terrified, hunted 7-year-old boy from a small castle in northern France ends up on this hilltop, staring down an entire kingdom, we have to go all the way back to the beginning. Back before the crown, back before the invasion, back before anyone knew his name at all. 2 worlds, 1 narrow sea. Here's a question for you. What does it take to be called a duke? And what does it take to be called a king? Because those 2 words are about to matter more than almost any other words in this entire story. And if you don't understand the difference now, nothing that happens later will make sense. Let's set the scene. It's the 11th century. That means the 1000s, roughly 1,000 years ago. And Europe does not look anything like it does on a map today. There is no France the way we know it, no unified Germany, no single England ruled from one throne with clean, solid borders. Instead, imagine a patchwork quilt sewn together by 1,000 different hands, where every patch is stitched to the ones around it by promises, marriages, debts, and, very often, the threat of violence. This system has a name, feudalism. Here's the simplest way to picture it. At the very top, you have a king who technically owns all the land in his kingdom. But a king can't personally run every farm and every village, so he grants huge pieces of land to powerful nobles called dukes, counts, and earls, in exchange for their loyalty and their soldiers whenever he needs them. Those nobles then grant smaller pieces of their land to knights, in exchange for the knights' loyalty and swords. And those knights control the peasants and farmers who actually work the land. It's loyalty, stacked on loyalty, stacked on loyalty, all the way down, and the whole tower can only stand as long as everyone keeps their promises. A duke is not the same thing as a king. A duke rules a duchy, a large territory, but a duke is still technically supposed to answer to a king above him. A king answers to no one but God. That difference between ruling land and owning ultimate authority is going to become the single most important tension in this entire story, because our main character is going to spend his whole life as a duke who is treated like a lesser man before he becomes something the rules of his birth said he was never supposed to become. Now, picture a map of northern Europe. In the north of what we now call France, right along the coast, there's a region called Normandy. And if that word sounds like it's hiding another word inside it, you're right. Norman comes from Northman. Because a couple of hundred years before our story begins, this land wasn't French at all. It was raided, invaded, and eventually settled by Vikings, fierce warriors and sailors from Scandinavia who sailed south in their longships looking for land, wealth, and a place to call home. Around the year 911, one particular Viking leader, a massive legendary figure named Rollo, struck a deal with the King of France. Instead of Rollo continuing to raid and burn French towns, the king granted him this stretch of land along the coast on one condition. Rollo would convert to Christianity, swear loyalty to the French crown, and defend this territory as its ruler. Rollo agreed, and just like that, the Viking raider became the first Count of Normandy. Within just a few generations, Rollo's Viking descendants had done something remarkable. They had blended almost completely into French culture. They stopped speaking Old Norse and started speaking a dialect of French. They built stone churches instead of raiding them. They became some of the most devoted, most disciplined Christian rulers in all of Europe. But underneath that French polish, something Viking never fully disappeared. A hunger for conquest, a willingness to sail into the unknown, and an absolute refusal to accept no as a permanent answer. Now look just across the water from Normandy, a narrow, grey, unpredictable strip of sea called the English Channel, in some places barely 20 miles wide, close enough on a clear day to almost see the opposite shore, and yet different enough that it might as well have separated two entirely different planets. On the other side of that channel sits England, ruled not by dukes and counts in the French style, but by its own kings, its own nobility called earls, and its own language, Old English, a rough, guttural cousin of the languages spoken in Germany and Scandinavia. England too had been fought over by Vikings for centuries. In fact, only 50 years before our story begins, a Danish king named Knut had conquered the entire country and ruled it as part of a North Sea empire. Two worlds, one narrow sea between them. And somewhere on the Norman side of that water, in a small stone castle overlooking a market town called Falaise, a child is about to be born, who will one day drag these two separate worlds together, by force, by blood, and by a single brutal day in October that will echo through the English language for the next 1,000 years. His name is William, and nobody expects him to amount to anything at all. Every hero's story has a beginning that shapes everything after it. William's beginning was a wound that never fully closed. Around the years 1027 or 1028, historians aren't entirely certain which, a boy was born in the castle at Falaise, in the heart of Normandy. His father was Robert, a member of the ruling family of Normandy, who would soon become Duke Robert I. His mother was a young woman named Herliva. Now, here is where we have to be completely honest with you, because a good storyteller never pretends to know things they don't. Historians genuinely do not know very much about Herliva's background. Some old stories describe her as the daughter of a tradesman in Falaise, possibly a tanner, someone who prepared animal hides. Other accounts suggest she may have worked within the ducal household itself. The truth is, we simply don't have reliable records from that far back to say for certain. And any storyteller who tells you exactly what her family's house looked like, or what she said to young Robert, or what her daily life was like, is making it up. We're not going to do that to you. What we can tell you with confidence is this: Robert and Herliva were never married, and that single fact was about to define William's entire childhood and haunt him for the rest of his life. Here's what you need to understand about the word illegitimate. In the 11th century, this wasn't a private family matter. It was a matter of law, of inheritance, of reputation, and William carried a nickname that made it impossible to forget, even for a moment: William the Bastard. Today, if you called someone a bastard, it would just be a rude insult. But in William's time, the word had a very specific, very literal meaning. It meant your parents were not married when you were born. And in a world where power, land, and titles were passed down strictly through legitimate bloodlines, being illegitimate wasn't just embarrassing. It was a legal weakness that every rival, every enemy, every whispering noble in every hallway could use against you for the rest of your life. Think about that for a second. Imagine being judged, not for anything you did, not for any choice you made, but for the simple, unavoidable fact of how you came into the world. Imagine growing up knowing that grown men in positions of enormous power looked at you and saw not a person, but a problem, an inconvenient obstacle standing between them and land they wanted for themselves. That was William's childhood. Before he could walk, before he could speak, before he had done a single thing in his life, he already had enemies. William's bloodline stretched all the way back to that Viking warlord we met a moment ago, Rollo, the raider who became the first Count of Normandy back in 911. By the time William was born, 5 generations of Rollo's descendants had ruled Normandy, slowly transforming it from a Viking outpost into one of the most powerful, most feared duchies in all of Europe. William's father, Duke Robert, sat on top of that legacy, but his own claim to the title had come through conflict too. Robert had become Duke after his older brother Richard III died suddenly and suspiciously, and though nobody could prove it, rumors of poison followed Robert for the rest of his life. This was the world William was born into, a world where power was never simply given. It was taken, defended, and constantly threatened. Duke Robert never married William's mother, but he never abandoned his son either. Around the year 1034, Robert did something extraordinary for the time. He formally presented young William, still just a boy of 6 or 7, to the nobles of Normandy and had them swear oaths of loyalty to him as his chosen heir. It was Robert's way of saying before he ever left home, "This boy is mine, and he will rule after me." It was a promise that would cost a great many people their lives to keep. Because in early 1035, Duke Robert made a decision that would change everything. He announced he was leaving Normandy, leaving his young, illegitimate son behind, to travel all the way to Jerusalem on a pilgrimage, a religious journey undertaken to visit a holy site as an act of faith and devotion. It was an enormously dangerous trip. Jerusalem was thousands of miles away, across mountains, seas, and foreign kingdoms, and pilgrims regularly died from disease, robbery, or simple exhaustion long before they ever reached their destination. Some historians believe Robert made the pilgrimage out of guilt, perhaps connected to his brother's suspicious death. Others believe it was simply an act of genuine faith. We don't know for certain. What we do know is this: Robert never came home. On the road back from Jerusalem, in the summer of 1035, Duke Robert of Normandy died. He was likely poisoned, though, as with so much of this era, we cannot say for certain. He was still a young man, and back in Normandy, a boy of 7 or 8 years old, a boy the nobility already whispered about as the bastard, was suddenly, without warning, without preparation, proclaimed Duke of Normandy. Imagine that for a moment. Imagine being 7 years old, and someone tells you that you are now responsible for an entire territory full of armed, ambitious, dangerous men, many of whom don't believe you deserve to be there at all. If you think being a child duke sounds exciting, like something out of a storybook, with servants bowing and treasure rooms and a golden throne just waiting for you to grow into it, we need to correct that picture right now, because the truth is closer to a nightmare. For roughly a decade after his father's death, young William did not rule Normandy so much as survive it. Here's why. In the feudal world, a child ruler is an invitation to chaos. The powerful nobles who were supposed to protect and guide the boy duke instead saw an opportunity. Some genuinely tried to defend him. Others saw a helpless child sitting on top of a duchy they desperately wanted for themselves, or wanted to carve pieces out of. Over the following years, Normandy descended into a brutal, grinding power struggle with different noble families fighting each other for control, sometimes using William as a pawn, and sometimes simply trying to eliminate him altogether. The men appointed to guard and guide young William, his guardians, were murdered one after another in the chaos. Historical records tell us that his tutor was killed inside the very room where William slept. Think about that. A child waking in the dark, learning that the man meant to protect him had been killed just steps away. It's said that more than once, in the dead of night, William had to be woken from sleep and moved, quietly, urgently, from one castle to another, because word had reached his protectors that assassins were coming for him. Close your eyes for a second and imagine you are William. You are 8 years old. It's the middle of the night, and someone is shaking your shoulder. Not roughly, but urgently. the way someone wakes you up when there genuinely isn't a second to lose. There's no candlelight. You're told, in a whisper, not to make a sound. You're pulled from your bed, wrapped in a cloak too big for you, and led down cold stone stairs that you can barely see, one hand pressed against the wall to keep your balance. Outside, the air is freezing and smells like wet earth and horse. You're lifted onto a horse in front of a guard you barely know, and the two of you ride out into the dark countryside, away from the only home you've ever known, toward another castle whose name you might not even fully remember by morning. You don't know exactly who is hunting you. You don't know if the men riding beside you can be fully trusted either. You just know that being still, being quiet, and being fast might be the only thing standing between you and the same fate that took your tutor. This wasn't a single dramatic night. For young William, this was simply what childhood was, for years. Now open your eyes. That was a boy who had never asked for a duchy, never asked for a crown, never asked for any of this, and yet was forced over and over to survive threats that would terrify a grown man. Ask yourself, what does that kind of childhood do to a person? Does it break them, or does it forge something harder underneath? For William, it did both. It cost him any illusion of safety, and it built, somewhere deep inside that frightened boy, an iron determination that no one was ever again going to decide his fate for him without a fight. By the time William reached his mid-teens, something had shifted. The frightened boy who had been smuggled between castles in the dark was becoming a young man, and a dangerous one. Around 1042, at approximately 15 years old, William began to take personal rule of Normandy, meaning he stopped simply being a figurehead protected or exploited by others and started actually making decisions, leading soldiers, and asserting his own authority as Duke. His first real test came quickly. A rebellious lord had seized control of the very castle where William had been born, Falaise itself. Think about the symbolism of that, the town of his birth, taken from him by a noble who doubted a bastard-born teenager could ever hold real power. William didn't send someone else to deal with it. He led the assault himself, and he took Falaise back by force. It was a small victory in the grand scheme of Normandy's troubles, but it sent an unmistakable message. The boy who had spent a decade running from danger was done running. But the real test, the battle that would decide whether William survived as Duke at all, or ended up as just another footnote in Normandy's bloody history of failed rulers, came in 1047 at a place called Valais Dunes. A coalition of rebellious Norman nobles, led by William's own cousin, Guy of Burgundy, rose up against him. This wasn't a small disagreement. This was a direct attempt to strip William of his title and his life. Guy believed he had a legitimate claim to Normandy himself, and a significant portion of the Norman nobility, men who had never fully accepted William, the bastard, as their rightful ruler, rallied to his cause. William, still only around 20 years old, did something that would define the rest of his career. Instead of waiting to be attacked, he sought outside help and moved to meet the threat head-on. He allied himself with King Henry I of France, technically his overlord, the king Norman dukes were supposed to answer to, and together their combined forces met the rebel army in open battle on the plains near Seine. Picture it, 2 armies of mounted knights thundering across open farmland, the ground itself shaking under the weight of war horses in armor. This was medieval warfare at its most direct. No castle walls to hide behind, no siege to wait out. Just 2 forces meeting in the field, and whichever side broke first would decide the fate of an entire duchy. William's forces, fighting alongside King Henry's, crushed the rebellion. Guy of Burgundy's coalition was shattered. Some of the defeated rebels drowned trying to flee across a nearby river. Valais Dunes was the moment William stopped being a boy that powerful men maneuvered around and became a man that powerful men had to actually reckon with. He had survived his own childhood. Now he had survived his first real war, and he was just getting started. But surviving a battlefield is one thing. Surviving a marriage negotiation with one of the most powerful families in Europe, that was going to take an entirely different kind of nerve. Every great alliance in medieval Europe eventually came down to one thing, marriage. And around 1051 to 1052, William made a match that would prove to be one of the smartest and most personally important decisions of his entire life. Her name was Matilda of Flanders, and she was no minor prize. Matilda was the daughter of Baldwin V, Count of Flanders, one of the wealthiest and most influential rulers in northern Europe, whose territory sat just to the northeast of Normandy and controlled some of the richest trading towns on the continent. Marrying Matilda didn't just gain William a wife, it gained him one of the most powerful families in Europe as allies at a time when he desperately needed friends who weren't trying to kill him. Now, you may have heard wild legends about how William supposedly won Matilda's hand, dramatic, violent stories that have circulated for centuries. We're not going to repeat those stories here, because most serious historians today regard them as later inventions, added to the story long after the fact, without solid evidence behind them. What we can tell you, based on real history, is this. The marriage began as a calculated and strategic political alliance between two powerful families, and it grew into something rare for the era, a genuinely strong, loyal partnership. In a time and place where powerful men very often kept mistresses and fathered children outside their marriages, William is remembered by contemporary sources as unusually devoted to Matilda. He didn't just marry her for politics and move on. Together, they built one of the most successful royal partnerships of the medieval period. William and Matilda would go on to have 9 children together. Historians generally count 4 sons: Robert, Richard, William, and Henry, and 5 daughters. Several of these children are going to matter enormously to the rest of this story, especially the eldest son, Robert, and the future king, this second William. But Matilda wasn't just a wife raising children in a castle somewhere, disconnected from power. She became one of William's most trusted advisors, and eventually his regent, meaning that when William was away, often for years at a time fighting wars on the continent, or later ruling a second kingdom across the sea, Matilda was the one actually governing Normandy in his absence. She managed finances. She made political decisions. She held the duchy together. This was not a ceremonial role. This was real, substantial power, entrusted to her because William genuinely trusted her judgment. Think about what that says about their relationship. In a world built almost entirely around male authority, William handed the keys to his entire homeland to his wife over and over again because he knew she could handle it. That's not just politics, that's respect. With a powerful marriage secured, and Normandy finally beginning to stabilize under his rule, William turned his attention outward, to the enemies still circling his borders, and to a war for control of the continent that would take him another decade to win. Peace for William was never permanent, it was just a pause between wars. Throughout the 1050s, William found himself locked in an increasingly bitter conflict with the very man who had once ridden beside him at Valais-Dunes, his former ally, King Henry I of France. As William's power and territory grew, Henry began to see him less as a loyal duke and more as a dangerous rival, and the two former allies turned on each other. The fighting dragged on for years, with Henry allying himself with other Norman rivals and repeatedly invading William's territory. But William, the boy who had once been smuggled through the dark to survive the night, had grown into a commander who simply refused to be beaten. In 1057, at the Battle of Varaville, William's forces caught a portion of King Henry's invading army in a devastating position, trapped as they attempted to cross a river with the tide rising around them. It was a crushing Norman victory, and it effectively ended King Henry's ability to seriously threaten Normandy for the rest of his life. Then, in 1063, William turned his ambitions toward the neighboring county of Maine, a territory bordering Normandy to the south that had long been contested between the two regions. Through a combination of military pressure and political maneuvering, William succeeded in bringing Maine under his control. By 1063, William controlled more territory, commanded more loyal knights, and held more real power than almost any other duke in France, arguably rivaling the King of France himself in practical strength, even though, on paper, William was still technically Henry's subject. The boy nobody expected to survive childhood now stood at the absolute height of his continental power. But here's the thing about ambition like William's. It doesn't know how to stop at enough. And across that narrow, grey channel of water, in the Kingdom of England, a chain of events was quietly unfolding that would give William's ambition somewhere new and far more consequential to point itself. Because a promise had allegedly been made to William years earlier, a promise about a crown that wasn't even his own, and soon he was going to decide that a promise, real or not, was worth going to war for. To understand what happens next, we need to cross the channel one more time and look at England's own complicated, dangerous story of kings and conquest. Back in 1016, decades before William was even born, a Danish king named Knut had conquered England and folded it into a massive North Sea empire that also included Denmark and Norway. For a time, England was ruled not by English kings, but by Scandinavian ones. Eventually, though, the old English royal line was restored, and a king named Edward, remembered today as Edward the Confessor because of his deep religious devotion, took the throne in 1042. But here's the important part. Edward had spent much of his childhood and young adulthood living in exile in Normandy, after his family had been forced to flee England during the chaos of the Danish conquests. Edward grew up surrounded by Norman customs, Norman friends, and the Norman way of doing things. When he finally returned to England to become king, he brought many of those Norman connections and sympathies with him. Now here's where things get genuinely uncertain. And we're going to be honest with you about that uncertainty, because that's exactly what a good historian does. Norman sources, meaning historical records written by William's own people, with William's interests very much in mind, claim that in 1051, King Edward the Confessor, who had no children of his own, promised the English throne to William as his heir. According to this account, Edward, remembering his Norman upbringing and his connections to William's family, decided the crown should eventually pass to his Norman cousin. We simply cannot know with full certainty exactly what was said or promised or intended in that moment. What we can tell you is that William absolutely believed this promise was real, and he was about to build the entire rest of his life's ambition around defending it. But a promise whispered years earlier, with no witnesses who could be fully trusted, is a fragile thing to build a kingdom on. William was about to try to make it stronger by extracting an oath in person from the one man most likely to challenge his claim. In 1064, a powerful English nobleman named Harold Godwinson made a journey across the Channel to Normandy. Harold was not a minor figure. He was the Earl of Wessex, the most powerful nobleman in England outside the king himself, head of the wealthiest and most influential family in the entire kingdom. Historians still debate exactly why Harold made this journey. Some accounts suggest he was on a diplomatic mission for King Edward. Others suggest he may have been shipwrecked on the Norman coast and taken into William's custody before the visit could even become official. Either way, Harold ended up as William's guest, or perhaps, depending on how you look at it, William's prisoner in all but name, in Normandy. And here is where one of the most disputed, most consequential moments in this entire story takes place. According to every single Norman source, and this event is even carved into the most famous piece of art connected to this entire war, the enormous embroidered Bayeux tapestry, which we'll talk much more about later, Harold, while in Normandy, swore a sacred oath to William. He placed his hands on holy relics, sacred religious objects believed to carry the weight of God's judgment upon anyone who broke a promise sworn over them and pledged to support William's claim to the English throne after Edward's death. Here's the honest, complicated truth though. This oath appears in every Norman account of these events and is completely absent from English sources, including the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, which was the primary English historical record of the period. Not a single English chronicler writing at the time mentions Harold ever swearing any such promise to William. This is one of history's genuine mysteries, and honest historians today still argue about it. Did Harold really swear this oath, and English writers simply chose not to record something so embarrassing to their own hero? Was the oath real, but obtained under pressure, perhaps even under something close to captivity, meaning Harold may not have felt bound by a promise he never freely chose to make? Or did the Normans invent or exaggerate the story afterward to make their eventual invasion of England look less like naked conquest and more like the righteous punishment of an oath breaker? We don't know, and anyone who tells you they know for certain is telling you more than the historical record can actually support. What we do know is this: William believed, or at least publicly insisted, that Harold had sworn a sacred oath to support his claim to the English throne. And when that promise was broken, William was going to treat it not as a political disagreement, but as a crime against God himself, and use it to justify one of the most consequential invasions in the history of the world. Because in just 2 years, the man who died would not be Duke Robert of Normandy this time. It would be King Edward of England, and what happened in the days immediately after his death would set William on a collision course with an entire kingdom. On January 5th, 1066, King Edward the Confessor died in England, leaving behind no children and no absolutely undisputed heir. And here is where the tension that had been quietly building for 15 years finally exploded. On January 6th, 1066, the very next day, with what most historians agree was startling, almost indecent speed, Harold Godwinson was crowned King of England. Think about that timeline for a second. A king dies, and within 24 hours, one of his own noblemen, not a blood relative of the royal family, not the person William believed had been promised the throne years earlier, is sitting on it, wearing the crown. Across the channel in Normandy, William received this news like a slap across the face. In his eyes, this wasn't just disappointing, it was a betrayal on 2 separate levels. A betrayal of the promise he believed Edward had made to him back in 1051, and a betrayal of the sacred oath he believed Harold himself had sworn on holy relics just 2 years earlier. To William, Harold hadn't simply become king. Harold had committed what William considered an act against God. A perjurer, sitting illegitimately on a throne that rightfully belonged to someone else. William began almost immediately to prepare for war. And then that spring, something appeared in the sky over Europe that seemed to the people of the 11th century to confirm that something enormous, something world-changing, was coming. Halley's Comet blazed across the heavens in the spring of 1066, a brilliant, terrifying streak of light visible for weeks, dragging what looked like a fiery tail behind it. In a world without telescopes, without any scientific understanding of comets as predictable orbiting bodies, people across Europe looked up at that light and felt something close to dread. To them, this wasn't a natural astronomical event. It was an omen, a sign from heaven that a great king would fall, that a kingdom would change hands, that the order of the world itself was about to be violently rearranged. That comet was considered such a significant omen that it was later stitched directly into the Bayeux tapestry, depicted blazing over Harold's throne, while terrified onlookers point up at it in fear. A piece of art recording, in thread and cloth, that people at the time genuinely believed the heavens themselves were warning of Harold's coming downfall. William began gathering ships, soldiers, and supplies for an invasion that would take him across open water into a kingdom he had never set foot in, to fight for a crown that by every practical measure was not his. But William was not the only enemy Harold would have to face that year. And the first battle for England's crown wasn't going to happen anywhere near William at all. It was going to happen far to the north, against an entirely different invader, in a fight that would leave Harold's army bloodied and exhausted before William's forces had even set sail. Chapter 10, The Other Invasion. Here's something most people don't realize about 1066. William wasn't the only person who wanted England's crown that year. And the first great battle of this brutal year wasn't fought against the Normans at all. Harold Godwinson had a brother, Tostig Godwinson, and their relationship had collapsed into bitter rivalry. Tostig had once been the powerful Earl of Northumbria in the north of England, but he had been driven out of his position by his own rebellious subjects, and Harold, now king, had refused to support his brother's attempt to reclaim it. Furious and humiliated, Tostig turned against his own brother entirely and went looking for allies powerful enough to help him take revenge. He found one in King Harald Hardrada of Norway, a legendary warrior king, nicknamed Hardrada, meaning roughly hard ruler, or ruthless, who had spent decades as one of the most feared military commanders in Europe, even fighting as a mercenary as far away as Constantinople before becoming king of Norway. Harald had ambitions of his own toward the English crown, and Tostig's rebellion gave him the perfect excuse to invade. In September 1066, Harold Hardrada and Tostig landed in the north of England with a massive invasion fleet. They won a bloody victory against local English forces at the Battle of Fulford, and English resistance in the north seemed on the verge of collapse. King Harold, still in the south of England, anxiously watching the Channel for any sign of William's invasion fleet, received word of the northern invasion and did something almost unbelievable. He turned his entire army around and marched them north, nearly 200 miles, at astonishing speed to meet this new threat before it could spread any further. On September 25th, 1066, Harold's exhausted army caught Harold Hardrada's forces by surprise near a river crossing called Stamford Bridge. What followed was one of the most complete and devastating victories in English military history. Harold's forces crushed the Norwegian invaders. Both Harold Hardrada and Tostig were killed in the fighting. The invasion fleet that had arrived with hundreds of ships reportedly needed only a fraction of that number to carry the survivors home. It should have been Harold's finest hour, a stunning military triumph that proved his skill as a commander and his ability to defend his crown against a serious foreign threat. Instead, it became one of the great cruel twists of medieval history, because at almost the exact moment Harold's exhausted, battle-worn army was celebrating their victory in the north of England, hundreds of miles to the south, the wind that William had been waiting for months, finally began to blow in the right direction. Harold's men had just marched nearly 200 miles and fought a brutal, bloody battle. They had no idea that within days they would be ordered to turn around and march the entire way back south again, straight toward the single most consequential day of their lives. Chapter 11, The Crossing. While Harold's army was fighting for its life at Stamford Bridge, William had spent months waiting, and waiting is its own kind of agony for a man as impatient as William. By late summer of 1066, William had assembled an extraordinary invasion force at the mouth of the River Dive, later moving to the port of St. Valery-sur-Somme. This wasn't a small raiding party. Historical estimates suggest William gathered somewhere in the range of 600 to 700 ships, carrying somewhere between 7,000 and 10,000 soldiers, along with thousands of war horses. Transporting horses across open ocean in the 11th century was an enormous engineering challenge, and William's fleet included specialized horse transport ships, built with ramps and reinforced hulls, specifically designed to carry war horses safely across the channel without the animals panicking and capsizing the vessels. This kind of large-scale amphibious horse transport had almost never been attempted at this scale in European history before. But an invasion fleet is completely at the mercy of the wind. For weeks, and then for months, through most of August and into September, the wind blew from the wrong direction, or didn't blow at all, trapping William's massive army on the French coast, burning through supplies, growing restless, waiting for conditions safe enough to cross open water with hundreds of heavily loaded ships. Finally, on the night of September 27th to 28th, 1066, just days after Harold's brutal victory at Stamford Bridge, hundreds of miles to the north, the wind shifted. Imagine you are one of William's soldiers, standing on the deck of a ship in the darkness of that September night. The air smells like tar, salt, and damp wood, the smell of a fleet that has been sitting, waiting for weeks. Around you, hundreds of other ships creak and groan in the black water, their outlines barely visible except for the faint lantern lights hung from a handful of vessels to keep the fleet from scattering in the dark. You can hear the horses somewhere below deck, shifting nervously in the cramped, swaying space, unable to see anything, unable to understand why the world beneath their hooves won't stop moving. You can hear men around you praying quietly or gripping the rail with white knuckles, staring out into a darkness that could be hiding storms or enemy ships, or nothing at all. You simply don't know. Nobody on that fleet has ever done this before. Nobody knows exactly what's waiting on the other side of this black water. All you know is that the wind has finally turned, the Duke has given the order, and there is no going back now, only forward, into the dark, toward a shore you cannot see. That is the crossing William's entire invasion made. Thousands of men in the dark, trusting a leader they'd followed across a duchy, a war, and now an ocean, toward a kingdom none of them had ever set foot in. By dawn, the fleet reached the English coast, and William's forces landed at Pevensey, on the southern coast of England, largely unopposed. Harold's army was still recovering hundreds of miles away in the north. And then something happened that could have been a disaster. As William stepped off his ship and onto English soil for the very first time, he stumbled and fell face first onto the beach in front of thousands of his own watching soldiers. In a world absolutely obsessed with omens, remember the comet, this was a catastrophically bad sign. A leader falling flat on his face the instant he touches enemy soil. Soldiers around him would have felt a chill of superstitious dread ripple through the ranks, exactly the kind of moment that could quietly poison an army's confidence before a single sword had even been drawn. But William, quick thinking even in an embarrassing accident, rose up from the sand with 2 fistfuls of English earth still clenched in his hands, held them up high for his men to see, and shouted something to the effect of, "By the splendor of God, I have taken hold of England with both my hands." Whether he genuinely thought that quickly, or whether the story was polished later by writers eager to make William look brilliant, we can't know for certain. But it worked. What could have been read as a disastrous omen was instantly reframed in front of the entire watching army as a symbol of destiny fulfilled. William didn't march straight into the English countryside looking for a fight. Instead, he made a cold, calculated decision. He established a base at Hastings, a coastal town not far from where he had landed, and ordered his men to construct a hastily built wooden castle there, a fast, temporary fortification designed to give his army a secure, defensible position while he decided his next move. But William did something else too, something far darker and far more deliberate. He ordered his soldiers to raid, burn, and devastate the surrounding Sussex countryside, the farms, villages, and lands of the very English people he claimed the right to rule. Why would a man claiming to be the rightful, righteous king of England deliberately destroy the land and homes of his own future subjects? Because William understood something ruthlessly practical about how to fight the war he needed to win. He knew Harold was rushing south from his victory at Stamford Bridge. William also knew he was in a genuinely dangerous position. His army was on foreign soil, cut off from easy resupply, and every single day he waited was a day Harold could use to gather more soldiers, more support, and a stronger position. William needed Harold to fight now, on ground William had chosen, before the English king could fully rebuild his strength. By burning the countryside, land that technically belonged to Harold as king, William was sending a brutal, unmistakable message. Your people are suffering right now, and every day you wait to face me is another day I destroy more of what you claim to protect. It was a calculated provocation, designed to bait an exhausted, still recovering Harold into rushing south to fight before he was fully ready. It worked exactly as William hoped. Instead of resting his battle-worn army, gathering reinforcements, and approaching the coming fight with patience, Harold, furious at the devastation of his own lands, and perhaps eager to prove himself decisively after his triumph in the north, marched his exhausted forces south at speed, straight toward William's waiting army. 2 kings, well, 1 king, and 1 man who believed a crown had been promised to him, were now on a direct collision course, on a hillside just outside Hastings, and only one of them was going to walk away from what happened next. This is it, October 14th, 1066, the day that changes the English language forever. Harold arranged his exhausted but determined army along the ridge of Senlac Hill, about 6 miles from Hastings. His strategy was simple, disciplined, and on paper, genuinely strong. Form a shield wall. This meant his soldiers, particularly his elite bodyguard, known as the Housecarls, locked their large, round wooden shields edge to edge, forming an unbroken wall of wood and iron along the high ground, bristling with spears and battle axes. An enemy attacking a well-formed shield wall on high ground was attacking a fortress made of human bodies. William's army, arranged at the bottom of the hill, faced a genuinely difficult tactical problem. He had archers, infantry soldiers on foot, and crucially, heavily armored cavalry, mounted knights on war horses, which was a battlefield advantage the English largely lacked. But cavalry is far less effective charging uphill into a locked shield wall than it is on open, flat ground. William needed to break that wall or find some way to draw the English off the high ground where his cavalry could finally do what it did best. The battle began in the morning with volleys of Norman arrows arcing up into the sky, raining down onto the packed English shield wall. Imagine you are standing inside that English shield wall near the front line on Senlac Hill. Your shield is locked tight against the shields of the men beside you, so close you can feel their shoulders pressed against yours, hear their breathing, smell the sweat and leather and iron of thousands of men packed together on a ridge above a battlefield. The noise is enormous, shouting in two different languages, the clash of the first skirmishes below, horns blowing signals you're trying desperately to remember, and then someone shouts a warning and you look up. The sky darkens, not with clouds, but with arrows, hundreds of them, arcing high into the air before tipping downward and beginning their fall, faster and faster, straight toward you and the wall of men around you. There's no time to run. There's barely time to think. All you can do is raise your shield above your head, brace your legs, and wait for the sound of iron striking wood all around you, praying that the shield in your hands and the discipline of the men locked in beside you is enough to keep you alive for one more volley. This is what discipline under fire actually feels like. Not fearlessness, but the choice to hold your position anyway, shoulder to shoulder with the people beside you, even while your entire body is screaming at you to run. For hours, the battle raged in this brutal, grinding pattern. Norman infantry and cavalry charging the hill, the English shield wall holding firm, wave after wave breaking against it like a rock in a river. At one point, rumors even spread through William's own ranks that he had been killed, the exact moment we opened this entire story with, and it took William tearing off his helmet and riding along his own lines, showing his living face to his men to stop a panic that could have ended the invasion right there. Eventually, Norman forces began using a tactic historians still debate the details of, the feigned retreat. Some of William's cavalry appeared to break and flee down the hill in disorder. Believing the Normans were genuinely routing, portions of the English shield wall broke formation to chase them down the slope. A fatal mistake. The moment those English soldiers left the safety of the locked wall, William's cavalry wheeled around and cut them down in the open, where mounted knights held every advantage. Slowly, gap by gap, charge by charge, the English shield wall began to weaken. And then, sometime in the late afternoon, King Harold himself was killed. Here again, we need to be completely honest with you. The most famous version of Harold's death, an arrow striking him in the eye, comes largely from the Bayeux Tapestry and later written accounts, and it has become the single most iconic image associated with the entire Battle of Hastings. But historians today genuinely debate how accurate that image actually is. Some of the earliest written sources describe Harold being cut down by Norman knights in close combat rather than killed by an arrow at all. It's entirely possible that both things happened, an arrow wound followed by a fatal blow from knights who reached him in the chaos. We simply cannot say, with full certainty, exactly how Harold died. What we do know is that he died on that hillside, fighting to the very end, and that his death broke the last of the English resistance. With their king dead, the English shield wall finally collapsed. Some soldiers fought on in small, desperate pockets. Most fled into the surrounding woods as darkness fell. By the end of the day, William's forces held the field. The Battle of Hastings was over. But, and this is something so many retellings of this story get wrong, it did not mean England had been conquered. Not yet. Not even close. Winning a single battle, even a battle as decisive as Hastings, is not the same thing as controlling an entire kingdom. William still had to march through hostile territory, secure the loyalty, or at least the surrender, of England's remaining nobles, and formally take the crown he believed had always been his. It took about 2 months of careful, sometimes brutal maneuvering, but on December 25th, 1066, Christmas Day, William was crowned King of England at Westminster Abbey in London. It should have been a moment of pure triumph, the culmination of everything. The boy once smuggled through the dark, now standing in a golden crown inside one of the most sacred buildings in England. And in many ways, it was. But it was also somehow almost farcical. According to accounts of the coronation, as part of the ceremony, the assembled crowd inside the abbey was asked, in the traditional custom, whether they accepted William as their king, and they responded with a loud, enthusiastic shout of acclamation. in both French and English. The Norman soldiers standing guard outside the abbey, hearing this sudden, enormous roar of noise coming from inside the building, in a foreign language they couldn't fully understand, from a king they had only just placed on a foreign throne, in a city they didn't yet fully control, panicked. Believing an assassination attempt or an uprising was underway, they began setting fire to nearby houses, apparently as some combination of retaliation and crowd control. Inside the abbey, smoke began drifting through the doors. The ceremony reportedly descended into chaos and confusion, with parts of the crowd fleeing outside in fear, even as the coronation ritual continued. So the very first moments of William's reign as King of England were marked, quite literally, by fire and panic, just outside the walls of his own coronation, an almost unbelievably fitting symbol for everything that was still to come. Because the truth is, England had not been peacefully conquered on Christmas Day, 1066. It had only just begun to be conquered. For the next 6 years, William would discover that winning a crown and holding a kingdom are two very, very different battles, and the second one was going to be far uglier than the first. Here is something the popular version of this story often leaves out entirely. 1066 did not end the war. It only started a new, longer, uglier phase of it. Between 1067 and 1071, William faced wave after wave of English resistance and rebellion. English nobles who had submitted to him rose up again the moment they thought they saw an opportunity. Regions in the west, the southwest, and the north all erupted into open revolt at various points. William responded to every single one with the same ruthless efficiency, rapid military campaigns, and, critically, the construction of castles. This is one of the most important, lasting legacies of William's conquest, and it's easy to overlook. Before 1066, castles as we typically imagine them, imposing stone fortresses, were relatively rare in England. William changed that almost overnight. Everywhere his armies marched, they built fortifications. First quick, simple wooden structures called motte and bailey castles, built on raised earth mounds, and later, permanent stone fortresses as a way of physically controlling the surrounding territory, garrisoning soldiers, and making rebellion enormously more difficult and costly. One of these fortresses, begun in 1078, was a massive stone keep constructed at the heart of London itself, deliberately built to be visible from across the city as a permanent, looming reminder of Norman power. Today, we know it as the Tower of London, and it began its life not as a royal residence or a prison, but as a fortress specifically designed to intimidate William's own new subjects. But no single act of William's reign in England reveals the brutal side of his character quite as starkly as what happened in the north, in the winter of 1069 and 1070. We need to slow down for this chapter and think carefully together, because this is the part of William's story that forces us to sit with real, uncomfortable complexity. Not easy heroes and villains, but the honest, difficult truth of history. In 1069, rebellion broke out across the north of England, in the region around York, partly fueled by local uprisings, and partly by an invasion attempt from Denmark, whose king still had his own claims and interests in English affairs. William crushed the initial rebellion, but he decided that crushing the immediate uprising wasn't enough. He wanted to make absolutely certain that the north of England could never again seriously threaten his rule. So, over the winter of 1069 to 1070, William ordered a campaign of deliberate, systematic devastation across a huge stretch of northern England, an event historians today call the Harrying of the North. His soldiers burned villages, they destroyed stored crops and grain reserves, the food that entire communities depended on to survive the winter. They killed livestock. In some accounts, they even destroyed farming tools and salted fields to prevent future planting. This wasn't random plundering by an out-of-control army. Contemporary and near-contemporary sources describe it as a deliberate, calculated act of destruction, intended to break the North's ability and its will to resist him ever again. The human cost was devastating, with crops burned, grain reserves destroyed, and livestock slaughtered in the middle of winter. Widespread famine followed across the region. Historical accounts from the period, including from chroniclers writing not long after the events, describe scenes of desperate suffering. In entire communities reduced to starvation, with reports of people dying from hunger and cold across a wide stretch of northern England in the months that followed. Some contemporary writers estimated the deaths in the tens of thousands, though modern historians debate the exact numbers, since precise records from this period simply don't exist. What every source agrees on is that the devastation was severe, widespread, and long-lasting. Some accounts suggest parts of the region remained noticeably depopulated for years, even decades, afterward. Here's the uncomfortable question we have to sit with together. How do we think about a leader who could show such loyalty to his wife, such careful strategic patience, such genuine religious devotion, and also order a campaign that starved thousands of ordinary people, most of whom had nothing to do with the rebellion that provoked it in the first place? We're not going to hand you an easy answer, because there isn't one. Some historians argue William saw this as necessary, even standard, warfare by the brutal logic of his era. A calculated act meant to permanently end a cycle of rebellion, arguably preventing even greater bloodshed down the road by ending resistance decisively and immediately. Others argue that no strategic justification fully accounts for the scale of civilian suffering it caused, and that it stands as one of the darkest single acts of William's entire reign. What we can tell you is this: it worked, in the sense that northern England never again seriously rebelled against William's rule, and it remains, even 1,000 years later, one of the most morally difficult chapters of his entire life. We're asking you, the viewer, to hold both of those truths at the same time, because that's what real history requires of us. But the north wasn't the only place still resisting William's crown. Far to the south and east, in the flooded marshlands of the Fens, one last stubborn pocket of English resistance was about to make its stand. Chapter 17, The Last Stand in the Fens. Not every act of resistance against William ended in devastation. Some became legend. In the eastern marshlands of England, a waterlogged, difficult-to-navigate region known as the Fens, an English nobleman named Hereward, remembered in later legend as Hereward the Wake, led a determined resistance movement against Norman rule. The Fens made an almost perfect natural fortress. This was a maze of rivers, marshes, and flooded wetlands, extremely difficult for outside armies to navigate, and Hereward used this terrain brilliantly, launching raids against Norman forces and holding out as one of the last significant pockets of organized English resistance in the entire kingdom. His base of operations was the Isle of Ely, at the time a genuine island raised above the surrounding marshland, accessible only by boat or by narrow, hidden causeways that outsiders struggled to find. In 1071, William personally led a determined siege against this stronghold, reportedly ordering causeways built across the marshes to finally bring his forces within reach of the rebels. Eventually, the Isle of Ely fell to William's forces. Some accounts suggest Hereward himself escaped and continued resisting for a time afterward, eventually disappearing from the historical record, his ultimate fate genuinely unknown, which is exactly how he became such an enduring figure of legend in English folklore for centuries afterward. Hereward's story became so popular in later English tradition that stories about him were still being told, expanded, and embellished hundreds of years after his actual life. A reminder that even in defeat, resistance against a conqueror can become something that outlives the conquest itself. With the fall of Ely, the last major organized English rebellion against William's rule came to an end. After 6 brutal years, not one day at Hastings, but 6 years of continuous warfare, William's control over England was finally genuinely secure. Now the real work could begin, not conquering England, but transforming it permanently into something it had never been before. Conquest is one kind of change. What William did to England over the following years was something deeper, a transformation that would echo for centuries, all the way down to the language you're hearing this very sentence in right now. The most immediate change was who owned the land. William systematically stripped the vast majority of English nobles, the old Anglo-Saxon earls and landholders, of their estates and redistributed that land to his own loyal Norman followers, the men who had crossed the Channel with him and fought at Hastings and in the years of rebellion afterward. Within about 20 years of the conquest, the overwhelming majority of England's land and titles had passed from English hands into Norman ones. one of the most rapid, complete transfers of wealth and power in medieval European history. We've already talked about the castles that reshaped England's physical landscape, but William also reshaped its spiritual and institutional landscape. He appointed a brilliant Italian churchman named Lanfranc as Archbishop of Canterbury, the most senior religious position in England, and together William and Lanfranc carried out sweeping reforms of the English Church, replacing English bishops with Norman ones, reorganizing church administration and tightening the connection between the English Church and Rome. Incredibly, French remained an official language of English law courts all the way into the 1700s, meaning the linguistic aftershocks of William's conquest were still being felt more than 600 years after his death. Over generations, these two languages didn't stay neatly separated. They collided, blended, and transformed one another. Old English absorbed thousands of French words, especially words connected to government, law, food, and the arts. Words like parliament, justice, beef, and castle itself. This slow linguistic collision is a huge part of why modern English today has such an enormous, unusually rich vocabulary compared to many other languages, often with two words for similar concepts, one rooted in Old English, one in French, sitting side by side. Think of the difference between the humble Old English-rooted word kingly and the fancier French-rooted word royal. Both mean almost the same thing. Both exist in English today because of what happened after 1066. There was one more significant, quieter change during William's reign, the gradual decline of slavery in England. Slavery had existed in Anglo-Saxon England before the conquest, but over the course of William's reign and the decades following it, the practice slowly diminished, partly due to church influence and partly due to broader economic and social shifts in Norman-controlled England, eventually fading out almost entirely by the 12th century. But even as William reshaped an entire kingdom, the most painful battles of his final years weren't going to be fought against English rebels at all. They were going to be fought against the people closest to him, his own family. There's a bitter irony sitting at the heart of this next chapter, and it's worth pausing on before we tell it. The same fierce determination that had once let a fatherless, threatened boy claw his way to a duchy and then a crown. That exact same trait was now growing inside William's own eldest son, and it was about to turn father against child. William's oldest son was named Robert, later remembered by the nickname Robert Curthose, roughly meaning short boots or short stockings, a nickname referencing his relatively short height. Robert had been promised from a young age that he would eventually inherit the Duchy of Normandy, William's original homeland and power base, separate from the English crown. But as Robert grew into adulthood, he grew impatient. He wanted real authority, real land, real power to govern, not just a distant promise of inheritance someday whenever his powerful, seemingly unstoppable father finally died. William, for his part, was famously reluctant to actually hand over meaningful power while he was still alive and ruling, an unwillingness that created deep, growing resentment in his ambitious eldest son. This tension exploded into open conflict. Between 1077 and 1080, and then again in 1084, Robert actually rebelled against his own father, not once, but repeatedly, at times even allying himself with William's political enemies, including the King of France, against his own father's interests. Historical accounts describe at least one occasion during these conflicts where Robert and William's forces clashed directly on the battlefield, with some sources even claiming Robert unknowingly wounded his own father in the confusion of combat before recognizing him and immediately calling off the attack in horror. Think about the weight of that story, true in its details or not. A father who had survived assassins as a child, survived rebellions as a young duke, survived the crossing of an ocean and the conquest of an entire kingdom, nearly brought down not by an enemy, but by his own son's ambition. This wasn't the only family betrayal William faced. In 1075, a group of William's own powerful Norman and English nobles, men who had once been his most trusted supporters, rose up against him in what's remembered as the Revolt of the Earls, driven by their own dissatisfaction with William's rule and rewards. William crushed this rebellion too, but it was a stark reminder that even the loyalty of the men closest to him could never be fully guaranteed. William had spent his entire life fighting to build something no one could take away from him. Now, in the final years of his life, he was going to discover that even a crown, even a conquered kingdom, couldn't buy him peace within his own family. And the effort to finally understand and control everything he had built was going to lead to one of the most extraordinary documents in all of medieval history. At Christmas in 1085, William, now approaching 60 years old, sat in his court and made a decision that would produce one of the most remarkable documents in all of medieval European history. He ordered a complete, comprehensive survey of the entire Kingdom of England, every county, every town, every village. Royal officials fanned out across the kingdom, asking detailed, exhaustive questions. How much land does this estate contain? Who owns it now, and who owned it before the conquest? How many people live and work here? How many plows? How many oxen? How many sheep? How many pigs? How many watermills? What is this land actually worth? The result was the Domesday Book, named after Doomsday, because, much like the final Christian judgment described in Scripture, this survey was considered so thorough, so absolute, that its findings could not be appealed or disputed. Once your land and property were recorded in the Domesday Book, that record was final. The Domesday Book recorded an almost unbelievable level of detail across the entire kingdom, including, remarkably, over 5,600 individual watermills scattered across England, each one individually counted and recorded, along with detailed information about livestock, population, and land value for thousands of individual settlements. Why would a king in his late 50s, nearing the end of his reign, order such an enormous, exhausting undertaking? Historians believe several motivations were probably at work together. William wanted a precise understanding of exactly how much tax revenue his kingdom could generate. He wanted a clear, permanent legal record of who owned what land to prevent future disputes, and he likely wanted a complete accounting of his kingdom's military resources in case he needed to call on them for future wars. But there's something almost poetic about it too, isn't there? A man who had spent his entire life fighting to hold on to power that others tried constantly to take from him. A man whose own childhood had been defined by chaos, uncertainty, and violent instability, spending the final years of his reign trying to pin down, in exhaustive written detail, exactly what belonged to whom, once and for all. Maybe, after a lifetime spent surviving other people's ambitions and betrayals, William simply wanted, at long last, absolute certainty. He wouldn't get to enjoy that certainty for very long. In the summer of 1087, in his late 50s, William led what would become his final military campaign. The conflict began, as so many of William's wars had, over territory, this time involving a dispute with the King of France over the town of Mantes, near the border between Normandy and French royal territory. William led an assault on Mantes, and his forces set fire to the town during the fighting. According to traditional accounts, as William rode through the burning, smoking ruins of the captured town, his horse reared or stumbled. Some accounts suggest the horse was startled by hot embers or a hidden obstacle in the wreckage, and William was thrown forward violently against the pommel of his saddle, the raised front part of a medieval saddle, suffering a severe internal injury to his abdomen. The injury did not kill him instantly. Instead, it left him in agonizing pain for weeks, as his condition slowly, steadily worsened. He was carried to the Abbey of Saint-Gervais, near the city of Rouen in Normandy, where he spent his final days. On September 9, 1087, William, Duke of Normandy and King of England, once known simply, dismissively, as the Bastard, died. And what happened immediately after his death is honestly one of the strangest, saddest final chapters of any powerful medieval ruler's life. You might imagine that the death of one of the most powerful men in Europe would be followed by an outpouring of grief, ceremony, and careful, respectful preparation for a magnificent royal funeral. Instead, according to contemporary accounts, something close to the opposite happened. As soon as William died, many of the nobles and attendants who had been gathered around him reportedly abandoned the scene almost immediately. Some accounts suggest they rushed off to secure their own estates and protect their own interests amid the uncertainty of a kingdom and duchy suddenly without a ruler, while others may simply have stripped valuables from the room. William's body, according to these accounts, was left largely unattended for a period of time before proper funeral preparations finally began. When his funeral finally took place at the Abbey of Saint Etienne in Seine, an abbey William himself had founded years earlier, the ceremony reportedly went wrong in almost darkly comic fashion. According to contemporary accounts, William's body had become so swollen during the delay before burial that when attendants attempted to force it into a stone coffin that had been built too small, the body reportedly ruptured, filling the church with an overwhelming, horrifying odor that sent mourners fleeing the ceremony. It's a genuinely strange, almost unbelievable end for a man who had spent his entire life fighting, successfully, relentlessly, to control absolutely everything around him. In death, even his own body refused to cooperate with the dignity his life's achievements might have seemed to demand. William's story didn't even get to rest peacefully in that grave. Over the following centuries, his tomb was disturbed, opened, and looted multiple times, during religious conflicts in the 1500s and again during the chaos of the French Revolution in the late 1700s. Piece by piece, across hundreds of years, almost his entire skeleton was lost, scattered, or destroyed. Today, remarkably, only a single thigh bone believed to belong to William the Conqueror survives, still kept at the site of his original burial in Caen, nearly 1,000 years after his death. But before we close his story completely, we have to look at what he left behind, because even in death, William managed to plant one final seed of family conflict that would shape England and Normandy for generations to come. On his deathbed, William made a decision that reflected both his complicated feelings about his eldest son and his practical understanding of how power actually worked. He divided his inheritance. Robert Curthose, the son who had rebelled against him, sometimes violently, years earlier, inherited the Duchy of Normandy, the original homeland and power base of William's entire family line. But William's second surviving son, William Rufus, nicknamed Rufus for his notably ruddy, reddish complexion, inherited the far more prestigious and valuable prize, the Kingdom of England itself, becoming King William II. The youngest son, Henry, initially received a large sum of money rather than land, though Henry, showing some of his father's own patience and ambition, would eventually go on to become King of England himself years later, after outliving and outmaneuvering both of his older brothers. Splitting the inheritance this way virtually guaranteed future conflict. Normandy and England, which William had spent his entire adult life fighting to hold together under a single ruler, were pulled apart again the moment he died, setting his own sons up for decades of rivalry, warfare, and shifting alliances against one another, echoes of the very same family conflict that had plagued William's own final years. It's hard not to notice the pattern here, isn't it? A man whose own childhood was defined by chaos, threat, and uncertain succession, spending his entire adult life fighting to build something stable and secure, only to leave behind an inheritance divided in a way almost guaranteed to produce exactly the kind of instability he had spent his whole life fighting to escape. So what in the end do we actually make of William? Here is a boy born into a world that had already decided before he could even speak what he was allowed to become. A boy called bastard his entire life, in a society where that word wasn't just cruel, it was a genuine legal and social weapon that powerful men used against him from the moment he was born. A boy who watched the men meant to protect him murdered around him, who was smuggled through dark castle corridors in the middle of the night just to survive to see another morning. And somehow, out of all of that, out of fear, out of instability, out of being underestimated by nearly everyone who ever looked at him, he built one of the most powerful duchies in Europe, married one of history's genuinely strong royal partnerships, and then did something almost nobody in medieval European history had ever successfully done. He crossed open water with an army and conquered an entire kingdom that had never asked for him against odds that should have destroyed him the way they destroyed so many other ambitious men of his era. But we cannot, and we should not, tell this story as a simple, uncomplicated tale of a hero triumphing against the odds, because this is the same man who ordered the deliberate starvation of thousands of people in the north of England during a brutal winter, in a campaign of destruction so severe its effects were still felt generations later. This is a man whose ambition and whose brutality were never fully separable from one another, whose greatest triumphs and his darkest acts often came from the exact same relentless, uncompromising will. Think about the modern version of this tension for a moment. Have you ever known someone who worked incredibly hard to prove themselves, to overcome circumstances nobody chose for them, and who, in the process of proving the world wrong, also became someone who could be genuinely, seriously hard on the people around them? Ambition and ruthlessness so often grow from the very same root. William's life is one of the starkest examples of that pattern in all of European history. The England William left behind in 1087 was, in almost every conceivable way, a fundamentally different country than the one Harold Godwinson had briefly ruled. Its land had changed hands almost completely. Its landscape was studded with new stone castles that hadn't existed a generation before. Its language was beginning a centuries-long transformation that would eventually produce the English spoken today, a language shaped permanently by the collision William forced between two separate worlds. Its systems of law, church, and governance carried Norman fingerprints that would last for centuries to come. Was William a hero? Was he a villain? The honest, uncomfortable answer, the answer history actually gives us if we're willing to sit with complexity instead of easy stories, is that he was neither, and both. He was a boy who refused to accept the terms he had been born into and became one of the most consequential figures in the history of the English-speaking world. He built and he destroyed. He was loyal to the people closest to him, and he could be utterly ruthless to anyone who stood between him and what he believed was his. So, here's the question we'll leave you with. The same question historians have been arguing about for nearly 1,000 years, and probably will keep arguing about for 1,000 more. When you weigh everything William built against everything he destroyed to build it, when you weigh the boy who survived against the king who conquered, where do you land? That's not a question with an easy answer, and maybe that's exactly the point.